Herzlich willkommen, liebe
A warm welcome to all our viewers to our series Natural Medicine Today. Today I'm talking about epigenetics with my guest Dr. Heidi Wichmann and how we can manage to get an optimal condition for our genetics with the help of nature and what tricks and tools are there. Stay tuned. Hello dear Heidi, thank you for your time. Yeah, hello, nice to be back. Yeah, we just had a preliminary talk. It was so full of ideas. All we had to do was press record and run for 5 hours. Just half an hour later. Oops, yes, exactly. But it's just a special time. And you notice that people are simply becoming more aware and realizing, oh, I just want the optimal condition now for my genetics, epigenetics, create the best conditions so that everything runs perfectly or runs again, depending on the situation. And I am very happy that I can really go into depth with you today as a biologist, cell biologist. Yes, my pleasure. Many still know epigenetics from Dr. Bruce Lipton, also a cell biologist, and I'm a neurobiologist and some say a marine biologist, and I've worked in those fields too, but ultimately I've always worked with cells, so I'm actually a cell biologist like Bruce. And I met Bruce some years ago. I was a graduate student and participated in the mentoring program. And while the others all somehow focused on business or university or something, I looked there too. I looked at different things. I then had the impulse to write to Bruce Lipton and see if he had time for an interview. And I just wrote him a few lines, my situation, this inner contradiction that you experience, and the next morning I had a direct answer from his assistant with a suggested appointment. And it was a really great conversation. He also sent me a lot of DVDs. I mean, I knew all his lectures and stuff anyway, but ultimately, that was such an important contact for me back then. And I just totally understood how important it actually is what he says. So, in short, Bruce has been researching stem cells for well over 50 years. He was a renowned cell biologist. He really got a lot of money from the pharmaceutical industry, who are simply the main sponsors of science. We see that today as blatantly as ever before, and he was also at renowned universities. So, elite universities, and you wouldn't believe it. Recognise there that the stem cells, these stem cells, are obtained from one cell. They are all genetically identical, completely the same. And he found that the surrounding cell medium, where the nutrients are in, ultimately affects what this stem cell that can develop into any cell then eventually will develop into. So bone cell, fat cell, heart cell, and so on. We humans have over 200 different cell types in our bodies. We have somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 genes, but the Human Genome Project was then basically carried out when I was still studying. I remember when a fellow student had to give a lecture on genetics. Really, we had a really, really mean genetics professor. He always found something to ask you in such a way that you couldn't get any further, and he knew it. And in the end, it came out that we are not, as people think, the slaves of our genes. So, of course, there is this solid blueprint that makes up every human being, that I look the way I look, that you look the way you look, but also twins, that they really are actually genetically identical, really look the same. And a lot of research has been done here as well, and it was then simply found that there is simply another so-called epigenome, which is superior to this, that also exists. There are very, very many, and they are just different in every human being and are simply shaped and played by various influences that are described as epigenetic factors. So our genes are just like a blueprint where external influences ultimately then trigger mechanisms in the body that is built one way or the other. Now, a quick bit about epigenetics and genetics, and this contradiction in science even today. So epigenetics has already been mentioned. You can now find a lot more than when I was studying, and there was already the internet back then. But it is hushed up, and it has still not reached people's consciousness. And I noticed that again in the situation where we are not going to talk about it in more detail, but I would like to remind you that if the organism survives, nature throws out unfavourable changes. So I know that because I also know the PhD students who desperately tried to genetically modify a bacterium on their own and are completely despairing because it didn't work. For some it works, for some it doesn't. One works, the other suddenly doesn't. So I just think people think the science is too strict. But it's not like that. It is enough that your manufacturer has changed something from an ingredient in your nutrient medium for this bacterium, and be it just its place of purchase, that it is sourced from somewhere else. It doesn't matter what it is. And your bacterium, which you have laboriously cultivated, no longer grows. We've seen it all. We are able to breed far less than 1% in the laboratory from the sea. So that has to be really clear to you. And as I said, nature tends to keep throwing out genetic mutation. There are more stable ones, there are less stable ones. And it's also simply the case that through our diet, we also have an influence on our genes, and then of course also see it morphologically, right? So just in the skin. And Bruce does that, of course. And he is absolutely right that the thoughts, of course, have a significant impact. But there are also nutrients that are really beneficial. For example, a green tea ingredient is actually classified as an epigenetic factor as well. Ultimately, everything is an epigenetic influence. My food, our conversation. Now I'm more in a monologue, but it also the air and what toxins I'm exposed to, which positive fragrances I'm exposed to, everything I watch on the internet, whether I'm watching a violent video or a more uplifting one, and all of this plays around on the piano of our genes. And now in science, if you classify something as an epigenetic factor, there really isn't much. For example, this ingredient from green tea, where in China it is recognized that through green tea consumption, cancer has gone down a lot. And there they were also able to prove that the so-called methylation of this gene, which is ultimately responsible for it, is simply influencing a gene which has a positive effect on the breakdown of cancer cells. So a gene is there first, then ultimately becomes a protein, for example, or a macrophage or whatever, so part of the immune system. And that is simply caused or positively influenced by some substances, and some of them are also negatively influenced by other substances from which we are now also exposed to numerous things. Now, I would like to stick with the green tea. We also have that with other, let me put it that way, natural remedies. It always depends on the quality, doesn't it? Absolutely. What are the criteria for a green tea for you? So with green tea, what I drink is matcha, for example, because I have to say that because of the high demand, the quality is mostly pretty good. So I would have a look. Of course, you have to pay attention to certain certifications, although you never know what's really going on there. But I think you taste it and notice it very quickly. So if you want to get away from a coffee addiction, for example, or if you really like coffee with milk, matcha latte is a very good alternative. It tastes different, but it also gives energy when really wants that caffeine hit, but slower and longer, more enjoyable. So it's hard for me to describe. And with plant milk, for example, really tasty. I really like that. And you have to look. But to get a good quality green tea, I can also get that in a tea house. I have that now, or also on the internet. Of course, you have to try it out, and it's just a substance. So I think that the endocannabinoid system is also particularly involved there somehow. I think the importance of the endocannabinoid system is still underappreciated. Most people only know it through cannabis and THC and getting high. And it is not surprising there's such a negative propaganda against it. Even Germany can no longer fight it because more and more people are getting medicine from cannabis. I'm talking about medicine here and not the other. So really, for example, the Rick Simpson oil, to me, the cannabis plant is the most amazing plant on land. And it's algae in the sea, and the two together. Unfortunately, I'm limited here, but I think a lot is possible there. And I also think that particularly old plants, which we also have receptors for, are also very, very important and have a more intensive effect on the senses than other things do. It's also interesting that the traditional European medicine is now up again, that we really use our medicinal plants again. So really the dandelion, the nettle, this one too, dandelion, nettle, but also turmeric, these roots, we have a variety of great natural substances that are simply there. And of course, it's difficult to find good quality ones now. And a lot of people don't know either, what do I have to watch out for? But in the end, you can only ever give one tip. When it comes to dietary supplements, make sure that there are no flow aids or any other substances in there. Of course, this then reduces the quality, and often they are not natural mixtures either, while it is suggested otherwise. But ultimately, in turn, for example, they have a negative effect on the microbiome of the intestine. So the intestine is, of course, absolutely important. With Asian people, a bacterium from the algae was passed into the intestines so that they can also digest the substances better. For example, polysaccharides. That is also possible, that also happens, and it is also an epigenetic influence. But now briefly to this classification. So really, you pay more attention to the so-called methylation, so methyl groups, which then virtually dock into the gene and thus silence it. And that is, of course, a dynamic process. But on the other hand, of course, you also need the right source so that body has enough of it and everything is also in balance. On and off, on and off. And you want the good genes to be on, so to speak, and the not so beneficial ones off. But in the end, this only advantages and no negatives doesn't exist. It's always an interplay. Just like inhaling and exhaling. If I just breathe in, I'll die too. And I think this way of thinking is very important. And I just want to remind you again that there is epigenetics. I'd love you to watch a lecture by Bruce Lipton. Many accuse him of always saying the same thing. And I have to tell you one thing, with all the questions I keep getting, again and again, I sometimes ask myself, are the people actually watching, or do they listen to what I say? It's just simple. Everyone also hears other things out. And I, too, always hear new things when I see a lecture by Bruce Lipton, for example. So that's normal. But as I said, I don't see in our world right now that people here have all understood that there is epigenetics. Yeah, there are many who are afraid and of course worried, maybe in shock too, trauma. Those are things that come into play. I mean, there is also the fears of death that also arises, and then it's difficult to think anyway. Yes, of course, due to the cortisol and other factors, people are acting out of a life-threatening situation, meaning they are in the brainstem rather than the conscious field, and rather act, as said, out of a life-threatening situation. And of course, you're rougher than when that's different. But as I said, algae also have positive epigenetic factors. For example, at least one has been described. I've mentioned that sometimes also with Alexander, but not very clearly now. But what I found really fascinating was this Japanese professor with whom I am also in contact, and we were both the only ones in the world who did research with this substance. And I think we just really saw that there is such potential behind it. It's always a question of whether it applies to humans, because mice aren't humans, even if you're always told otherwise. But nevertheless, you have certain hints, and for example, there's this one called S-adenosilmethionine, and that's just sort of proof of this methylation potential. What you want isn't a substance that increases that now just because I'm deficient, or reduces it because I am in abundance, but I want something that regulates or ultimately triggers regulation in the body. Because the substances don't do anything else. It's not that the substance itself does that, but the substance intervenes somewhere so that the body can regulate it itself. And with the DMSP, which is mainly in the sea lettuce, that's why it's my favourite, that was just shown in experimental mice that were genetically manipulated and stable, so across generations. So that means if the mouse has babies, again now, they will also have this disease. So these mice are bred in such a way that they have certain diseases. For example, in old age, they are born almost as old mice, but still grow and already have hair loss and ailments of all kinds. And what they did have was that after a certain period of time, a few weeks, these mice no longer showed any difference from the control mice, neither in lifespan nor in appearance. So yes, their hair has grown again, and that just shows this strong influence, I think, which can definitely lie in natural substances and also just keeps our health. Yes, it is important that we summarise the most important factors in any case. That salad you were talking about with the seaweed, sea lettuce, that's the so-called trivial name of this sort. That's the Ulva lactuca, it's called. And it's called the sea lettuce because it looks like a lettuce leaf. It resembles it. It's also very green. And are there also factors like, for example, with iodine, where I still have to pay a little attention that there is a combination there, or consider an interaction issue? So the advantage of seaweed is that there are very different iodine contents. The sea lettuce has a lot of this sulfur substance, this DMSP I'm talking about that I've examined, but only a little iodine. That's why it's an alga that's far below the daily dose, which are officially recommended, and you can still talk about them. But in the end, of course, brown algae have the most. However, when taking iodine, one must be careful with the cofactors. And now everyone is going again, buying the isolated one from somewhere or that one. And then they need the so-called cofactors again, for example, vitamins, minerals, and so on and so forth, which are, of course, automatically included in the algae, but not in the individual substance of this double combination, which is usually taken. And you should know that. Of course, I get asked a lot about iodine. I usually refer to QuantiSana, who is really an expert. For me, iodine is just as misunderstood a remedy as inorganic sulfur or just ultimately all other things. So vitamin D3 is not ancient knowledge, but we all know by now that you really need it and have to take it as a supplement. And I see iodine in a similar situation, that we don't have that much in us. We're far too low in iodine anyway. Most people think they are fine with salt-containing iodine. The best you can really do is decide against it. It's better if you do that, because firstly, it's not the compound that the body needs and can absorb. And on the other hand, this type of salt is usually no longer what actually good sea salt, really untreated, that good sea salt can supply, and iodine also evaporates. If I have a pack of salt like that standing there, you don't know afterwards how much is in there, and you can't eat that much salt to be covered. Iodine. There is also an iodine congress, for example, which Kira is also taking part in. I think she was also the initiator, and where doctors and scientists really come and talk about results on high-dose iodine, for example. We're not talking about a few micrograms, but really about milligrams. I also took 150 milligrams a day for several weeks, which is a lot, and I noticed really positive side effects. The thing is that I think it also has something to do with all the poisons that go to the iodine receptors. For example, bromine does that. There has to be enough iodine in the body for it to be released at all, so that the bromine, for example, leaves the receptor and the iodine can dock. Well, that's one of those things that I would always really pay attention to, if necessary, involve a therapist or doctor, because we really often have people who have problems with the thyroid, and you can never say that in general, because of course every person reacts differently to every substance. It's no different with iodine, of course, and especially if you are very poorly cared for in this area, things can get worse. Be really mindful, especially if you have thyroid problems. I'm all for creeping in, and normally every cell needs iodine, not just the thyroid, especially women, so breast tissue, everything. Kira Kaufman also confirms that, especially for women who want to get pregnant and where it doesn't work out, where there was also often a key factor, namely iodine deficiency. It is often simply a lack of nutrients. You just have to find out what it is, and everyone can do that themselves. Yeah, super exciting. Finally, one more time for the viewers. The top 5 genetic optimization programs that you can read about. Everything with responsibility, of course. Well, in the end, it's like that. I say it all the time. And many of your guests here also say that. Mind the nutrients sensibly. Live a life that you really want to live, so out of inner persuasion. Because if I always do things that go against my inner conviction, my cells will notice that, and of course the genes too, and so on and so forth. And it's just that, on the one hand, that I live my life the way I want it, with people that I want, but also really pay attention to it in harmony with nature, because ultimately nature is also a very, very important epigenetic factor, ultimately earthing too. So when you walk barefoot on the earth, and of course I'm an absolute seaweed fan, you know that, but ultimately really this wild, again, that we find the way back to this wild, because from my point of view, this is the only way to heal in any direction. Also for the madness in which we are increasingly finding ourselves. Yes, again, this trust in nature, and I also find the abundance that is also shown to us there indicates that we might have been given a false worldview. Yes, I think so too. Great. Dear Heidi, thank you very much for your time. And if you still want to deal with the topic a bit or get any good sources, can you give a little tip or two? I also have a Telegram channel. You can find a lot there. I also have a little something on my website, in my book. So ultimately, I think it's important to be self-aware of what's good for me, and you can feel it very clearly. And it has usually also arrived successfully in the genes. Great, then I thank you, and I hope that we will see each other again soon. Yeah, me too. See you soon. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Dear viewers, I hope you were able to take something with you for your health, and I'm always happy when you tune in. Many thanks. See you soon, and goodbye.